I want you to think of a movie or a TV show that you've seen recently, okay? Just think of one, it doesn't really matter which one. Now, what do you think contributes to making that movie or TV show, that story, what contributes to making that believable? Okay, think of that for a second. Now, probably the first answer most of us are thinking is the acting, right? If the acting's B-rated, most of us don't have any time for that. But there's another aspect that a lot of time, a lot of effort, a lot of money go into to making us believe that that's really true, and that's the costumes. If the person doesn't look like the person they're portraying, we won't believe it. And this is actually true for the actors and actresses themselves. I used to do a lot of theater, and when I finally got in costume was finally when I was able to, I think, believe myself who I was trying to portray, and thus convince the audience. In fact, I've brought a few embarrassing pictures to show you. Here's the first one. This was when I was actually engaged to Jen. I think after this moment, I think she was wondering why she said yes. Here's the next one. This was singing Luck Be a Lady Tonight. There's another one here, and that is my real hair, believe it or not. It's just 12 months of not seeing the barber, and that's what it looks like. And then the last one, probably my favorite costume I ever had to be in. This role, when I was not in costume, you just look ridiculous. So trying to rehearse this role, and finally, once you get into costume. In ancient Greece, they used very simple costumes. Costumes that were pretty much just a mask. And they'd have lots of different kinds of masks that people would wear for different characters. Now, what's interesting, and what's really the point of all this, is do you know the ancient Greek word for an actor? It's the word hypocrite. It's the word, it means to be a pretender, someone who's playing a part, someone who is actively trying to convince people that they are someone different than they really are. It was simply the word that we would use for actor. Now, in this passage that Aiden read for us, Jesus comes down pretty hard on the religious leaders. It's not a very cheery passage. In fact, in the parallel passage to the one he read in another gospel, Jesus uses this word hypocrite to talk about these religious leaders. He's saying, you've got a mask on. You're pretending. Your faith, it's not more than this external outward show. Now, lest we think that this was just an issue back in Jesus' day, I was reminded of a poem that went sort of viral on YouTube about 8 years ago. It was written by a guy named Jefferson Bethke, and the poem was entitled, "Why I Hate Religion But Love Jesus." And he recited this poem standing in front of a church and put it on YouTube, and it got 35 million views, which means you've probably actually heard it. You may not remember it. But if you go to the YouTube page, there's 150,000 comments on this one post, but don't read them, because if I've learned anything, nothing good comes from reading comments on YouTube posts. But this poem really struck a chord. It hit on a nerve, and it's really the same topic that Jesus is addressing of this facade of religion, this pretense that exists sometimes in the church. I want to show you a couple stanzas from this poem. Here's one stanza. "Religion might preach grace, but another thing they practice. Tend to ridicule God's people. They did it to John the Baptist. They can't fix their problems, and so they just mask it, not realizing religion's like spraying perfume on a casket." Throughout this whole poem, it's really contrasting two things. This rule-keeping, appearance-maintaining religion versus this sort of real, personal, and vibrant relationship with Jesus that transforms you from the inside out. It's sort of contrasting these two. Look at another stanza. "See, I spent my whole life building this facade of neatness, but now that I know Jesus, I boast in my weakness. Because if grace is water, then the church should be an ocean. It's not a museum for good people, it's a hospital for the broken." And when this thing came out, I must have watched it 10, 15 times. I kept wrestling with what is it about this that it really strikes with something for me. And here's what it is. I think it puts words to a tension that I feel, that I'm sure many of us feel. And here's the tension. On one hand, there's there's this gospel of grace. That I am a sinner through and through, and yet I'm loved and I'm forgiven by the sacrificial death of Jesus on my behalf. There's that truth on that side. And then, yet over here, there's this pull to sort of be perfect, to sort of keep up appearances. That okay, I'm saved by Jesus, but now that I'm saved, and I am a sinner, but I've been saved, now I need to act like I'm not a sinner anymore. I need to pretend, I need to put on this face that I'm not anymore. And you know, what's funny is sometimes this same tension or this same pressure we feel even in church. Like, it's okay to come into church as a sinner, but don't stay a sinner very long once you get into church. And I think that is some of what Jesus wants to talk about in this passage today. Is that what discipleship is all about? Is discipleship just about sort of fixing up the outside? Is it about keeping all of the rules and sort of keeping up with the status quo? Is that what Jesus really came to do? And friends, I would say the answer is no. Jesus came to do so much more than fix up the outside. In fact, Jesus came to do what the outside could never do. He came to bring this internal transformation that would actually change a person's soul. And so Jesus, we're going to drop in on this little episode where he's sharing a meal with the religious leaders, and he's going to speak to this. So if you have your Bibles, open up with me to Luke chapter 11. We're going to start in verse 37. We'll probably make it to about the mid-40s, but then we'll jump to the end of this little episode. We'll have the verses on the screen as well. But this is a meal scene that Jesus has with these religious leaders. There's actually 3 of them in the book of Luke. 3 times Jesus eats a meal with religious leaders. And let me tell you, you don't want to go to any of those meals because they always get really intense. It's like that dysfunctional family gathering that you're like, I think I'll come back later for dessert. I mean, you don't want to be here. It always gets really intense. All right, so let's jump into this. Here's what we're going to see. Jesus is going to sort of call out this incorrect focus that the Pharisees are living with. And he's going to tell them why it's incorrect. And then he's actually going to give them 3 sort of specific examples as to how that incorrect focus is working out in their lives. And so Jesus puts his finger, this is a rebuke passage, this is a correction passage, but at the same time, if we have ears to hear it, I think as his followers, I think we can hear sort of an opposite corresponding invitation as to how Jesus is calling us to live. So would God give us grace to have hearts to receive that as we go through this. So look at verse 37. When Jesus had finished speaking, a Pharisee invited him to eat with him. So he went in, he reclined at the table, but the Pharisee was surprised. Your version may have astonished, marveling, wondering, and not in a good way, by the way. The Pharisee was surprised when he noticed that Jesus did not first wash before the meal. Now, at my household, I can totally relate to this. We've got 3 small children, the 2 boys especially. I think their favorite thing to do is play in dirt. And then they come inside and they try to just sit at the table and eat. And almost every day we're like, no, stop, go, wash. So I can relate to this. But there's something deeper going on for the Pharisee here. This isn't as much about hygiene for him as this is about religious devotion. You know, they would, somebody like Jesus especially, a well-respected rabbi, he would do these ceremonial washes to sort of display his devotion. Especially somebody like Jesus who's been hanging out with these unclean sinners all the time. So of course Jesus would wash. That's how he would show his devotion, but he doesn't. He just digs right into the food. And this Pharisee's like really grossed out by that. And it's so visible, and Jesus knows what's going on. And he knows what he's thinking, and so Jesus speaks to that. Verse 39. Then the Lord said to him, "Now then, you Pharisees, you clean the outside of the cup and the dish, but inside you are full of greed and wickedness. You foolish people." Now, by calling them foolish, he doesn't mean you stupid people. Fool in the Bible is someone who doesn't understand who God is or what God is doing. The opposite of the fool is a wise person. So that's what he's saying when he says, you foolish people. Did you not understand? Did not the one who made the outside make the inside also? But now as for what is inside, be generous to the poor, and everything will be clean for you. Now just imagine being at this dinner table. I mean, can you imagine? Jesus sits down, starts digging and eating. This Pharisee's like grossed out and visibly disturbed. And then Jesus is just like, you fool! I mean, I imagine I just like keep my head down. Like, I'm just going to get the food and get out of here. So intense. So what's going on in this little interchange? Just look at Jesus' words for a second. He says, you Pharisees, you clean the outside of the cup and dish, but inside you are full of greed and wickedness. Now, Jesus is a master teacher. So he knows what's going on. And right there, he's looking at the table, and he sees the perfect object lesson. So he picks up a dish, and he's like, you're like this cup here, this dish here, and you work so hard on polishing the outside of it. Man, there's not a spot on there. You make sure it looks really great, but you're missing something that's crucially important. You're missing the inside of this. If all you do is worry about the outside, you get that all polished. If you don't care at all about what's in the inside, drink up. Right? The illustration sticks. Jesus doesn't just say to them, hey, let me tell you what's wrong with your inside. No, he actually shows them. He shows them if all you care about is the outside of your life, and you don't have any care at all about what's going on internally. Do you see how inconsistent that is? Jesus, he puts his finger on the issue for these religious leaders, and that is that they exclusively focused on the external to the neglect of the internal of their life. They just keep polishing. And I was thinking, this isn't too far off from our own current day, is it? Where we put so much time and energy, so much work goes into sort of keeping up appearances. And you know, social media actually exacerbates this, doesn't it? You know, like you have a good meal, and you think, oh, I'll take a picture and post it. That way everybody can see the good meal. And then it sort of sends the subtle message, all my meals are like this. Or we go on a great trip and we take a picture and post it and we show everyone how adventurous we are. I mean, there is such pressure that our kids are well behaved and they're always in line and that they're high achievers, that our marriages are happy, that our single lives are full and vibrant. There's such pressure to sort of keep polishing all the time, keep polishing, and it is exhausting. You know, as the church, we're not immune to this. There's pressure to come in and think, okay, I got it all together. There's pressure to look sort of spiritually mature or that I'm a deep person. And Jesus says to these religious leaders, he says, if you live like that and all you're worried about is the outside, you're a fool. And he tells them why. Look at verse 40. He says, you foolish people, did not the one who made the outside make the inside also? You see what he's saying? He's saying you can't fool God. You might think, I've got everybody fooled. I'm pretending everybody thinks I'm doing okay. The outside's nice and shiny. He says, but you can't fool God. Because God's the one who made the outside and the inside. He knows what's going on. All we can see about each other is the outside. And so, of course, there's this natural tendency for all of us to want to put extra focus on the outside. But there's no fooling God. But this is actually a really encouraging thing. And here's why. Because listen to Jesus' solution. Listen to his antidote, his prescription. Verse 41. He says, but now, as for what is inside you, be generous to the poor, and everything will be clean for you. Now, what does that mean? Be generous with what's inside. I think what Jesus is calling for here is a complete shift in focus. Rather than focusing on the external, focus on the internal, on what's inside. Of course, both matter to him. But what he's saying here is if you devote what's inside to the Lord, and his example here is generosity. He says if we're generous, not just with our external actions, but if we're generous in the inmost places, he says everything will be clean for you. Sometimes we'll use the idea of sort of a public face and a private face. And so does the public face of your life sort of match the private face of your life? And if it doesn't, bring your private face to the Lord and devote that to him. And here's the thing. We can bring that to the Lord because he's not appalled at that. He's not even surprised. He's the one who made the inside and the outside. So Jesus is saying, offer your inner life to him. Bring yourself to him. And what's inside will then flow outward, is what Jesus is saying. Listen to how N.T. Wright comments on this passage. He says, what Jesus meant by be generous of what's inside is something like give over to God for his use. True piety takes as much care about giving to God the thoughts, intentions, and motivations of the heart as about hand washing. See what he's saying? He's talking about the thoughts, the motivations, the intentions. Those are the inner things. And if we make that our focus, the outward actions take care of themselves. But listen, we can live with this internal focus in these very little sort of instantaneous moments of every day. Say this week you have a very hard meeting coming up. You know, before you step into that hard meeting, maybe you offer your inside to the Lord. Maybe you say, God, I'm really nervous right now. I'm really nervous to step into this. You know, I'm really worried that I'm sort of writing these negative scripts about these people. You just offer some of that internal stuff before you even step into that. What if you're going to have to correct your child this week? Well, maybe before you do, you stop and you say, God, well, first you say, God, help me not kill my child. No. You say, God, help me deal with the disrespect I'm feeling. Help me deal with the lack of justice that's going on. Help me deal with my anger. I'm going to offer these things to you before I step into this situation that requires my external actions. We can live with this internal focus at all these little moments throughout the day. And that's what Jesus is calling for. He's saying they both matter, but if we focus on the internal, the external will follow. And what Jesus does next in this passage is he's going to give 3 examples from their lives that he's observed of where this mixing up internal and external comes to light. And he's going to do it using a literary device called a woe. And I don't mean like, whoa, dude, that's cool. I mean like, whoa, something bad is about to happen. In Greek, they had these words that sounded like their meaning. Don't we have something like that in English too? Is that a onomatopoeia? That's right. So Greek had that too. So like the word pituo, it means to spit. The word for woe is uai. Something bad's about to happen. So here's these 3 woes. Woe to you, Pharisees, because you give God 1/10 of your mint, rue, and all other kinds of garden herbs, but you neglect justice and the love of God. You should have practiced the latter without leaving the former undone. Woe to you, Pharisees, because you love the most important seats in the synagogues and respectful greetings in the marketplaces. Woe to you, because you are like unmarked graves, which people walk over without knowing it. Now, woes are not curses. Woes are very, very strong warnings. It's kind of like a sign that says there's a bridge out ahead. Be careful. You do not want to continue on the course you're on. That's what a woe is. All right, so let's look at these 3 woes, and I'm just going to try to summarize them with simple phrases, each one of them. Okay? So the first woe, Jesus is really saying, you're missing the point. Woe to you, Pharisees, because you give to God 1/10 of your mint, rue, and all other kind of garden herbs, but you neglect justice and the love of God. You should have practiced the latter without leaving the former undone. Jesus is saying, hey, listen, you guys, you're keeping Leviticus 27 to the T. Great job. You are really honoring God with your herbs. That is awesome. But you're leaving out something that's slightly more important, like justice, like the love of God, which are just a little bit more important. It's like somebody coming along and sort of dropping a quarter in the Salvation Army bucket, and then saying, I've done the will of God today. See, the point of all of God's commands for tithing and for obedience is for the justice and for the love of God. But these Pharisees, they were making a sacred substitute. They were sort of checking the box in this one area so that they could go and live however they wanted in the rest of the areas of life. And they were ignoring these bigger, sort of more glaring needs that were right in front of them. And we do this too. This actually hit me a little bit personally this week because there was an area I realized, I can miss the point too. Each month when we get paid, Jen and I, we sit down, and the first thing we do is we give our money. Lots of you probably do this too. So we give to the church, we give to some missionaries, we support a child in China. And then, what I was convicted by was the way that I often live the rest of the month. I can often live with a check. I've done my giving. I've been generous. And then I can go live the rest of the month and not even have eyes to see or any sort of awareness of, how's God calling me to move towards people in need now? That's an example of sort of missing the point. God calls us to be generous, and yes, He wants us to be generous in intentional and planned ways, and He wants us to be generous in spontaneous ways. One of the phrases, if you've been around here very long, is, especially talking about theological doctrine and issues and things like that, is that we major on the majors and we minor on the minors. And that, as a church, has allowed us to maintain a sense of unity, even though there's diverse theological perspectives in this body. Because we refuse to let the minor things divide us. For these Pharisees, and as can often happen for us, the minor things sort of start to eclipse the major things. But notice what Jesus says. He says, you should have practiced the latter without leaving the former undone. Jesus isn't saying the minor things don't matter. What He's saying is don't neglect the main thing by focusing on the minor. Hold on to them both in their proper place. So missing the point. Are there any areas in your life where you're missing the point? Here's woe number 2. Living for the recognition of others. Verse 43. Woe to you, Pharisees, because you love the most important seats in the synagogue and respectful greetings in the marketplaces. I mean, who doesn't? Right? I mean, this is a very human thing. This love for acclaim, for recognition, for applause. Everybody loves that. It's a very human, sort of natural thing. C.S. Lewis, a Christian writer from a couple generations ago, he was giving an address to some graduates. And he said, hey, let me give you one piece of advice. And he gives them sort of a warning. And someone heard it and sort of wrote it down. And it's an essay now that's called The Inner Ring. I think I've mentioned it actually here before. But in this essay, this warning, he's talking about this tendency that we all have to notice that there are these rings of exclusivity all around us, relationally. We all sort of want to be a part of them. And students, this actually is really true for you too. This is not just an adult phenomenon. In every phase of life, we see this. This is why sometimes when you walk into the cafeteria, you might feel a little weird. Because we see these sort of rings of exclusivity and we desire to be a part of them. Well, listen to what Lewis says. He says, I believe that in all men's lives at certain periods, and in many men's lives at all periods, one of the most dominant elements is the desire to be inside the local ring, to be in the know, and the terror of being left out. So can I show you how this works? You can put up the next one. Let's pretend you're going into a social gathering, okay? So here we are. It's already started. We're a little bit late. And so this is the social gathering. And as soon as we walk through the door, go ahead, walk through the door, you all of a sudden you can start seeing all these little inner rings. I mean, it even probably happened this morning when you came in. It's sort of natural. You can go to the next one. You start seeing these rings, people who are sort of connected, who are talking, so there's a ring there, and those people are, and then, those two people I X'd out because they're on their devices. They're in no human ring right now. But there's all these little rings that are there. Now, here's the thing. The existence of a ring is not a bad thing. But this desire to get into a ring, that's what's really dangerous. And Lewis says it this way. He says, of all the passions, the passion for the inner ring is most skillful in making a man who is not yet a very bad man do very bad things. And we can do anything we can to get into a ring. So we sell out. We compromise. We compete. We pretend. Everybody wants to be in a ring. And once you get in a ring, you want to keep everybody else out because you don't want to jeopardize your position in that ring. But the maddening thing about this is even when you get into a ring, even if it's just a ring with one other person, you realize there's another ring inside of that one. I think these inner rings are kind of like these seats of recognition that Jesus is talking about. The Pharisees loved them. The Pharisees, they were supposed to use their seats of power and position for the betterment of the people. And yet they fell in love with the seat. They fell in love with the power. They fell in love with the recognition, with being in the headlines. And we clamor for this. These don't even have to really be physical rings. Sometimes you just see a person who sort of has it all together. Man, I just want to be with them. Or there's the group over there who's the achievers. And that's the group I want to get into. I want to prove my worth there. Oh, that's the healthy group, physically. I want to get in with them. I want to be healthy physically. There's the group for whom it's sunny on every day of their life. I want to be over there. And so we fake it. We sell out. We become a different person just so we can get into the ring. And you see the inside's not matching the outside. And Jesus calls the Pharisees out for that. Here's the third woe. I'm going to conclude here. It says, leading people astray. The third area where the inside and the outside could potentially not match up is in verse 44 here. Woe to you, because you are like unmarked graves, which people walk over without knowing it. Now, what does that mean? Unmarked graves. Well, this has to do with that need to be religiously pure in Jesus' day. And sometimes when people especially didn't have a lot of money and they couldn't afford to sort of bury someone properly, they would kind of just bury somebody in the ground secretively. They didn't want to get in trouble and they would just do it. The problem is if some unknowing person walks over that area, they become unclean. And so that's what Jesus is pointing to with the Pharisees, who are supposed to be leading people into life. They were actually leading people astray with all of their rules, all of their regulations, all of their rule keeping. They were doing the opposite of what they were intended to do. And as I've been thinking about this, the question I've been thinking about is, do we have any idea, do we have any real comprehension how our following Jesus is impacting the people around us? When nobody's looking, when we don't have to sort of keep up the social pressures that maybe exist here at church or something like that. When we're at home, do we know the impact that our following Jesus has on people around us? William Tom said, for many of us, we might be the only Bible that people read. So here's the question. How are people being led by the lives that we're living? Earlier we talked about a hypocrite in ancient Greeks, just an actor. We use that word very differently today, right? It has much more of a negative connotation. But hypocrisy is not imperfection. It's the lack of consistency. It's the lack of integrity. Hypocrisy is not, I don't get it right all the time. Hypocrisy is, I pretend to get it right way more than I don't. So are we like unmarked graves? Or are we showing those around us what sincere faith looks like? It's not perfection. It's repentance. It's humility. Now, we could go on and on, because this is the first three woes. Jesus has three more. In fact, in the very next verse, Jesus has been addressing the Pharisees. A lawyer stands up and says, hey, Jesus, and what you're saying to these Pharisees, it's offending us too. And I'm sure all his lawyer friends were like, just keep your head down, man. Because then what Jesus does is he turns to the lawyers and he gives 3 woes to them as well. But I want us to take us to the end of this little scene. Because what do we do with these woes? These woes are sort of hard to understand. What do we do with this? I want to show you how the Pharisees and these lawyers respond to Jesus. Look at verse 53. When Jesus went outside, the Pharisees and the teachers of the law began to oppose him fiercely and to besiege him with questions, waiting to catch him in something he might say. They were offended by him, and so they're like, all right, well, we disagree with you, and so we're going to fight. We're going to compete against you. We're going to try to expose you as a fraud so we can disregard everything you say. And here's what I want to point out. What if Jesus' woes could actually be an invitation to authenticity? See, the scribes and Pharisees, they took this as a confrontation, and they hardened their hearts, and they pushed Jesus away. What if instead of that, we could hear what Jesus is saying, and with soft hearts, we could say, we don't want any part of that. We want to respond instead to this invitation to come out of the shadows, to take down the mask, to stop the polishing, and instead live an authentic life. Real discipleship goes after the internal and the external. Now, how do we do that? And here's the beautiful thing about Jesus' invitation. He doesn't just say, hey, come out of the shadows, live a real life, be authentic, go. No, Jesus does what it takes to make it possible to do that. Because even if you just think about the 3 things that the Pharisees were missing the point on, just think of those 3 for a second. When Jesus makes this invitation for us to live in authenticity, the reality of who God is and who we are, look what Jesus does. Jesus doesn't just tithe 10%. No, Jesus gives everything to save us. And by doing so, by giving everything, Jesus not only maintains the justice of God, but he also demonstrates the love of God, the 2 things they were missing. And then Jesus, he doesn't seek the highest seat of recognition. No, he takes the lowest seat by being humiliated and killed on a criminal's cross, where he was rebuked by the world, rebuked by those he came to save. And Jesus doesn't lead us to an unmarked grave. No, you know what Jesus does? He dies, he gets buried in an unmarked one, and then he leaves behind an empty one, and he's going to come back someday, and he's going to give life to anyone who identifies with him. That's what Jesus does. What Jesus does, he invites us to come into the reality of who we are. He says you can come out of the shadows, you can stop pretending, and when you do, you can know that you're going to find forgiveness. You're going to find acceptance. You're going to find freedom. So how do we take hold of that? I want to give us one hard and yet very simple practice. And it's the practice of confession. Now, it's surely the confession to God. You know, 1 John 1:9. If we confess our sins, he's faithful and just to forgive us our sins and cleanse us from all unrighteousness. It's for sure that. But I'm talking about the kind of confession where we don't pretend anymore. The kind of confession that happens with the person who's safe in your life, the person who loves you, the person who prays for you. It's with that person that you say, hey, here's the habitual sin I keep wrestling with. Here's that attitude that I have more than I don't. Here's that sort of valley that I am just camped out in. And we confess. We offer that to this person who loves us, and we ask them to pray for us. If we want to get past pretending, if we want to get past religion, if we want to be a church that's alive and that's real, and that's not a museum for good people, but a hospital for the broken, we must learn this bold step of confession, because the only way that we'll actually take this step of confession is if we know that we've already been forgiven. That's what believing the gospel is. The gospel gives us the safety and security that I can both confess and I will be forgiven. So as I close, I just want to give us a little bit of space. The band's going to come. We're going to sing a couple more songs. But I'm not even going to close us in prayer. I want each of us just to have time to lay the mask down, to stop polishing, to be honest before the Lord and say, God, here's where I am now. So let's do that for the next couple moments, and the band can lead us.